Good afternoon. Before we begin the webinar, I'd like to offer a few tips for participating in today's event. Whether it's a technical question regarding the WebEx platform, or if you are submitting a content-related question, please use the chat dialog box on your screen and send to the host with the username SolutionTree. At the end of the session, our presenter will respond to as many questions as time permits, so please do submit your questions as they arise. If time runs short, Tim will answer some questions afterwards, the responses to which will be emailed to you with the link to the webinar recording and slides within 5 business days. My name is Jeff Brown, and I will serve as your moderator for this afternoon's event. In my role as a Director of Educational Partnerships, I work with a dedicated team to support your professional development needs through the work of SolutionTree authors. Please do not hesitate to contact me or one of my colleagues to discuss how our resources, events, and on-site PD workshops can help meet your ongoing professional development needs. Today marks the second of 3 webinars focused upon the PLC at Work process. We will learn how highly effective teams drive the PLC at Work process and fuel the Common Core state standards for mathematics. Additionally, we will discover how to maximize the efforts of teams for better learning results. Based upon the Common Core Mathematics and a PLC at Work series, this webinar describes a research-affirmed, unit-by-unit approach and provides teams with numerous tools for a successful Common Core implementation. Today's presenter is Dr. Tim Kanold, an award-winning educator, author, and consultant. Tim is also the former math director and former superintendent of Adlai-Stevenson High School District 125, one of the most decorated and successful high schools in the nation, as well as a model professional learning community district located in Lincolnshire, Illinois. Without further delay, I'd like to turn things over to Dr. Tim Kanold.
Well, thanks, Jeff, and thanks for that great introduction. I really appreciate it. I also want to thank everybody for taking the time to get online with us today and go through this webinar with us. I know it's not always the easiest format, but we really appreciate your willingness to do that. So as we were getting started today and as a way to have you get involved as you were waiting for us to get started, we had a poll. Here were the questions that I basically asked of you. All right, so here are the questions I asked. I thought, to get us started, we just sort of see what really is going on with the Common Core, what's sort of some of the validity behind, the information that you hear, make sure that we're all up on the same page. And the first thing is just to remind you that the Common Core is actually a set of state standards, not federal standards. And those two consortia roughly got about $175 million each in order to work on developing assessments within very specific guidelines for preparation, including the fact that they'd have to be ready by the spring of 2015. As you can see here, these are the PARC states. So if you're from one of those dark blue states, then you are definitely part of PARC and will be giving the PARC exams. If you're dark blue, you're considered a governing state, and which pretty much means you're all in. You're piloting items this year. You're going to be piloting more items next year and launching into the testing in the spring of 2015. If you're a light blue state, then you are participating in PARC but haven't fully committed to the PARC testing procedures yet. Smarter Balance covers states that really they're all regionally located throughout the United States, but Smarter Balance is the dark green, or the green states, I should say, are states that are governing states for Smarter Balance. The blue are states that are still participating in trying to determine if they'll participate in Smarter Balance or PARC, or perhaps neither, because it's up to the state to decide which consortium they'll be part of, or even if they will be. They're not required to be. The state makes that decision. And the two tests are a little bit different. The assessment mindsets are a little bit different. I'm not going to get into that today. That's not really the purpose of this webinar. But I would encourage you to go to either one of your state's websites. to take a look at that, and I'll give you that in just 1 second. The governing board states, if you're from either one, they're piloting, as I mentioned. The new assessments come in 2015. But most important is to know that part of their specs required them in mathematics to create 2 kinds of exams. One that would be multiple choice, like we're used to seeing currently with our state tests, and yet richer multiple choice items. And the other being these performance-based items, where students have to actually respond to problems and questions. One of the things that I've mentioned is that, on a very simple basis, the questions obviously will be more robust than this, but think of it in the past as like we would ask the question, evaluate to students in math, evaluate 2 to the negative third, and students would tell us, well, that's 1/8. Or hopefully they would know that's the choice, and that, because they know about negative exponents in 6th or 7th grade. But a similar question could be that 2 to the negative third equals 1/8, provide a mathematical argument that validates its truth. And now the kinds of responses students could have a variety of ranges of response to that, the mathematical argument they might choose. How you might score an open-ended response item like that, a performance-based item, is a little bit different. And just so you know, you can go to either Park's website or Smarter Balance website, and you can actually get sample items that they have for review or for you to look at and take a look at. You'll also see frameworks, the content frameworks, where they provide an emphasis on various aspects of the content standards themselves, and which of those standards are receiving greater emphasis than others within the progressions of those standards. You also get constant updates. For example, here's the Park a recent entry, actually now it's last May, but this is an entry that just shows the technology that's required on your campus for the students to be able to take the exam. Smarter Balance, they worked on this together, and you can see there's there's all kinds of information available regarding Park if you're a Park state that's available on their webpage and as part of their work. So I would encourage you to go there if you're one of those states. This is the Smarter Balance homepage and a sample of it. And in this case, you can see I grabbed this from the day that they actually released sample assessment items, and you can actually go see what some of those performance tests look like for K2, 3, 5, 6, 8, 9, 12. So just want to encourage you to do that. And now all of that takes us then to really what I wanted to deliver in our message today, which was how do we go about approaching the Common Core mathematics issues if you are working in a professional learning community or in a professional learning community at work. And one of the things that I worked with my own colleagues, we had 13 co-authors that worked together on our 5-book PD series, is that we wanted to make sure that we establish what is it that your team should be doing and working on in their professional learning community if they are going to be effective at delivering and sustaining an effort toward the Common Core. And that's the intent of our work and the work that we're doing. To help frame this a little bit and make it into a coherent story, because I think one of the things that's a problem that will be a problem with Common Core implementation is this notion that there's so many different voices and ways to go about it and tackle it. How can we do it in a way that actually gives our teachers and our teacher teams some autonomy to figure it out, but at the same time focus their work and energy on things that we know have a high payoff for improvement. One of the things I really believe is this notion of the teaching we do and the assessing that we do, and even how students learn, becomes part of a process of formative feedback. There's the 0.73 that you see on the screen there, right here, is actually the effect size that we know exists in a school that actually tries to do what I'm about to describe, to provide teaching, assessing, and learning as a process of formative feedback. In Visible Learning, John Hattie actually talks about that effect size, and an effect size of 0.73 is rather large. It actually means that there's a significant improvement in student achievement. You can't be too specific about the percent, like 14% or 18%, unless you look at the exact studies. But generally, any effect size of 0.4 or greater, I consider to be fairly significant. It's a standard deviation above the norm that students will perform if we can do this particular idea really well. And you might remember, those of you that came to, participated in Rick and Becky's webinar on PLCs at work a month or so ago, one of the things that they talked about was this ongoing process in which educators, this was their definition of a collaborative team, ongoing process in which educators work collaboratively, the professional learning community, I should say, an ongoing process in which educators work collaboratively in recurring cycles of collective inquiry and action research to achieve better results for the students they serve. Now, I chose in their quote to actually pick out the part on which you see here recurring cycles. And the question is, for your collaborative teams, what should that recurring cycle be, or what should it become? What does it need to be? And I would argue that for mathematics, it's best if it's a unit by unit or maybe chapter by chapter, if that's how you think of your content, basis. In other words, as we move to the Common Core, on a unit by unit basis, as we plan out the different standards that are going to have to be taught, what is it that teams should do both before the unit begins, during the unit, and after the unit? And how do we repeat that cycle over and over and over? That's the idea. And in our books, actually in Chapter 4, we established this particular, there's 5 chapters in the book. The 4th chapter really is on assessment, but we established this basic teaching, assessing, learning cycle. And in this 5-step cycle, there are clear, high leverage, high payoff activities that if the teacher team does these things for mathematics, we know students will learn at greater rates than ever before. So that's part of the research behind it and part of the basis for our work. So let's just take a look at the 5 steps briefly in the time we have today, and then I'll open it up to some Q&A. And as Jeff mentioned, if there are questions that we don't have time to get to, we will for sure. You can submit those, and I'll respond to them and get those to you. I'll respond to them in writing. All right, step 1. So on a unit-by-unit basis, and this has to be before the unit begins, and this is pretty much, for lack of a better term, non-negotiable. These are things that we would expect the teacher team has done. Now, you might do this in the summertime before the school year begins. You might do it, in advance of units. Well, you might be teaching Unit 1 or 2, and you're working on these things as a team for Unit 3 and 4. But ultimately, these are things that have to get done before the unit begins. And those 3 things are, number 1, agreement on the common learning targets, and the I can. What will the students be able to do and no one be able to do? I can. And generally tying that to the learning standards from the Common Core for that unit. So that generally is there. I think if you're working as a professional learning community, you're there in terms of getting that done. And I should say it's not only agreement on them, but it's agreement on how to implement toward them. The teams worked on those instructional discussions. The second thing is agreement on the common high-quality, high cognitive demand tasks that will be used during the unit. Now, this is a little new for some math groups, for some math teams. One of the demands of the Common Core is this notion of how students learn is as important as what they learn. And how they learn is based on the tasks that we give them. So it's an equity issue if some teachers on your team are giving great cognitive demand tests and other teachers on your team are not. The students shouldn't have that sort of educational lottery of, well, if I have this teacher, then I have a great math experience, or if I have this teacher, then I don't get that math, right, those particular tests. So one of the things we want is for the team to agree on what will be some, not every day, but there are 3 or 4 major tasks, performance tasks that the students are going to do throughout the semester, throughout the unit, and what will those be, and do we all agree on how to use them? And I'll give you a sample of one of those in just a little bit. But that would be decided before the unit begins. And then the last thing is getting agreement on the assessment instruments that you're actually going to use. You might think of them as your quizzes and tests and different ways that you actually formally assess what students know. You can think of these as sometimes they do have a summative purpose. That is, they might be used for a grade or for a proficiency performance measure. But the key is that you would be using those assessments, those common assessment instruments, for a formative purpose and part of a formative process. And not only do you want agreement on the assessment instruments themselves, but you want agreement on the scoring of those instruments. That's really important, that how many points is this quiz going to count, and what is the scoring rubrics that's going to be used for each problem on that quiz or test, and how do we have agreement on that? That we all agree, yes, this performance test, whatever it is, this instrument is worth 60 points. And it became 60 because these are the rubrics worthy of 60 points worth of student knowledge. And that we've agreed on that element of the test. The reason to do this is because of something that James Popham, who I consider to be, if you don't know James Popham, there he is, there's his picture. And Popham's really, really brilliant. And one of the things that I consider him to be one of our leading assessment thinkers in terms of influencing our practice in the United States regarding assessment and becoming assessment savvy. And Popham, look what he says. He says he kind of has this analogy between summative assessment instruments versus a formative process for using those tests and quizzes. And he describes it as the difference between a surfboard and surfing. And you know, without getting into all the details, I write about this, so we write about this in our series, but without getting all the detail, he says, look, a surfboard's an important tool in surfing. You need it to surf, but it's only that. It's part of the surfing process. So our assessment instruments, our quizzes and tests, they are an important tool, but they're only there in order to help the assessment and learning process that I described in the beginning. That gets that 0.73 that we're after, that high payoff for student learning. So the first question your team, I think, has to ask and answer is, on what basis do you even determine that your local tests are any good? One of the things I do, if I was to come into your school district, and or into your school and into your grade level, your 4th grade or your 8th grade algebra or your high school advanced algebra team, it wouldn't matter to me. But if I was to come into your school, first thing I would do is say, show me all your tests, all the local tests that you've written, that you use. What are the things that you do? And how do we know they're any good? How do we know they're based on what do you decide that your tests and quizzes, your surfboards, are any good? And you must ask that yourself. The Common Core era in mathematics is going to demand that we are giving really good and using, I guess, to use the analogy, really great surfboards to help teach our students to surf, to learn mathematics well. So the question just becomes, how do you do that? Now, one of the tools that we actually provide in the book for developing high-quality common assessment instruments is the one that you see here on your screen. And I know that's really hard to see, and actually when you look at it, you'll see it's the tool that's for the high school book, but it really wouldn't matter. This tool shows up in all the books in our series, including the Leader's Guide. And we've also provided you with a link that takes you direct to, so you can download this as a free resource. But in this case, there are 7 different things that we look at and say, tests, a great surfboard would have these elements in place, and they'd have them at the 4 level, you know, so they wouldn't score out at a 1, they'd score over at a 4. And I won't get into all the details of what those things are, but my message to you here today is that have a reason for why you give the surfboards you give. Have a basis on which you develop high-quality surfboards. And what are those elements that you would expect to see in every local test generated by a teacher team and given by that team? And I really think this is an important discussion and exercise. What I encourage most collaborative teams to do, use this as a basis, but then make your own. You know, if there's something missing in here or something that you don't think is quite right, one of the things that you'll notice is that we expect that all the learning targets are written on the exam. So actually, when you go to write up the test, you not only give the students the 12 questions or 15 questions or whatever, but the actual learning targets that are being tested by those questions are written on the exam. We consider that an element of a high-quality assessment tool or surfboard. All these things are research-affirmed, that if these things are there and in place, it really does help motivate student learning. They're also designed so that the test itself, the surfboard, can be used as a learning tool for the student and not just as a summative moment, a diagnostic tool, so to speak, like, well, you don't know this. Actually, that's fine. It might be diagnostic, but then it's going to be, and now what do you do? What do I want you to do with the 17 out of the 60 points that you missed, and how are you going to respond to that? And we expect students to be able to have that response, as I'll mention here in a little bit. In addition, there comes a point in time, whether with any of your assessment instruments, and remember these are all developed in step one, but it's either during the unit on quizzes or at the end of the unit, perhaps with your tests, any of those surfboards, how do you know that you're scoring them accurately is a great question. A professional learning community team will take the time to do the important task of actually grading some of their work together. And hold on here, I think I can do this, yes. And actually reflect on whether or not their scoring of the surfboards is actually accurate or not. And it's a great question. Like, here's how how you know that your scoring is accurate. Let's say you and I were teaching 7th grade math together. We're both teaching the course. We're teaching 7th grade. And maybe you call it seventh grade math, maybe you call it pre-algebra, I don't know what you call it, but let's just say it's seventh grade math, whatever you call it. We're teaching that course together. Would you trust me enough to give me all of your student papers and let me grade and score your papers? And then would I trust you enough to give you my students' responses and have you score my student papers? And the answer is probably not, because I wouldn't necessarily trust that you would grade them as accurately or with the same fidelity that I would, or vice versa. And so one of the things that we know from the research that really helps is when teacher teams in a professional learning committee actually do collaborative scoring together. By doing that, you do double scoring. In other words, you come together with a sample of student papers, not all your papers, just a small sample, and you actually do some double scoring together. I score, let's do a sample of yours, you score that same sample. You score a sample of mine, I score that. And we just see, gosh, is there calibration there? Are we pretty close? If I gave it 43 out of 60, did you give it 43 out of 60? If I gave it 5 out of 10, and let's say it was a 10-point quiz, did you give it 5 out of 10? And that calibration is really important, sort of creating anchor papers that let us know, well, what is really good student work for a problem like this or a quiz like this, and what is medium student work, and what is not so good work, and do we have agreement on how we would score those so that no matter who the student had for that particular course or grade level, if it's elementary school, the scoring accuracy, the grading of it would be pretty close. We would be pretty accurate there. What this does when you do this activity as a team is it creates a certain amount of inter-rater reliability because you begin to get pretty confident that we would be scoring work pretty closely to the same. And this is a high payoff action by a professional learning community team. And if you're way off, then that gets into great discussions about, well, why are we so far off? I was just last week at a high school where the teacher team was telling me that as they have begun to do this now this year, it's getting them into some great discussions about how they instruct things and what they expect students to actually be able to show for their work and what kinds of things should they show. And this is going to be critical in the Common Core era because the Common Core performance items are going to demand that our teacher team has some agreement on what high-quality student work would look like. And again, bear with me just one more second here and I'll give you an example of that. But before I do, I'd like you to just take a minute. I've got another poll here. I don't know how our polls are going to go, but if you don't mind, I'd like to get you just involved for a second here. I want you to rate your PLC collaborative team, the one you're on or part of, or if you have a bunch of them, then pick one and rate it, or if you oversee a bunch of them, whatever your role is. If you, in general, how would you rate your collaborative team? On this assessment continuum that I've just described, and you're going to rate them 1 to 4, and here's the continuum. And so hopefully you can see that on your screen. If you need to blow it up a little bit, maybe do that. But so you would rate yourself a 1 if you just don't even have them, a 2 if you have them, but you know what? Actually, we have common surfboards, but we actually don't all surf with them. Well, some of our teachers don't use them; they do their own thing. You'd be a 3 if you have them, but you don't really do any analysis. You're not really looking at student work together. You're not scoring them together. You're sort of missing out on that element of the work together. A level 4 would be you have them, you use them, but analysis does not lead to instructional decisions. In other words, yeah, you looked at the data, you looked at the results, but we didn't really make any adjustments over the next few lessons or the next unit of study because of it. And level 5 would be you have them, you all use them, you collaboratively score them, you analyze the data together, you make instructional decisions together. You guys are like awesome. You're like the model that we want to come see, right? And it's okay to be on this continuum. The question is just to keep working to get farther to the right on the continuum. So my question would be, if that poll's available to you, could you kind of enter it in? If it's not, just sort of voluntarily kind of assign a level to yourself. I won't be able to ask you to raise your hand to tell me exactly, but you get the idea here. So I'll give you a second to decide. Where are you? 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5? All right. So I'm going to move on. I'm not sure we've got the poll working considering our technical difficulties, so I'll just keep us moving along. And I am seeing some of your questions, and they're great, by the way, those of you that already entered some questions in. and Jeff will be kind of pulling them together, and we'll have, no matter where I'm at with this, I'll stop and we'll take 10 minutes at the end to do some of the Q&A. Now, steps 2 and 3 in the cycle, if the before stuff is done well, is really where you work hard on using these mathematical tasks during lessons and during the unit. And some of the tools that I just want to make you aware of are directly that we provide in our books are directly connected to the mathematical practices. And this is all Chapter 2 in our series of each book, K2, 3, 5, whichever book it is, it's Chapter 2. One of the things that you notice about the mathematical practices is the incredible pressure put on the students. One of the misnomers sometimes is that the mathematical practices are what teachers need to do. They're not actually. The mathematical practices are all about what the students need to do. So as you can see here in this summary of the practices, students have to construct viable arguments and critique the reasoning of others. Students have to model with mathematics. Students have to attend to precision. So it's very interesting how the mathematical practices in mathematics really put this great pressure on what students are supposed to become proficient in how they experience the mathematics. In other words, what you see in this picture, students are not modeling with mathematics, constructing viable arguments, or not reasoning abstractly and quantitatively with one another. But that's where we want to get them. That's what the new classroom is going to look like. Just to kind of briefly get you to shake hands with this, take a look at Mathematical Practice 3. If you break it down a little bit, Practice 3 is a great practice. It's titled Construct Viable Arguments and Critique the Reasoning of Others. This requires a lot of peer-to-peer discussion and communication in class. I had an administrator ask me the other day, Tim, I'm not really strong in math. What exactly can I do to help my team or to help my teachers, when I'm going in to observe them or do a walkthrough or do an evaluation, whatever. And I said, look, there's 2 things you can really do. Number 1, just watch the students. Don't really watch the teacher. It's not about the teacher. It's about the students. What are the students doing? And are the students doing things that are in agreement with the Common Core practices? So are students making conjectures? Are students justifying their conclusions and communicating them to their peers? Are students comparing the effectiveness of 2 plausible arguments? Are students listening and responding to the arguments of others for sense-making reasoning? That's what you want to see. Are the students doing these kinds of actions that are required of them? And you can help the That's not about the mathematics as much as it is the kinds of tasks that the teacher is establishing so that students will have that kind of learning experience. This is an example of a rich task that does just that kind of thing. Now, we're not going to do the task here today, but I want you to see the power of a team using a task like this. So the task is that Wikipedia, the math problem, or the mathematical task as we're calling it, is that Wikipedia reports that 8% of all Americans eat at McDonald's every day. And again, what you might think of Wikipedia, that's their report, 8% of all Americans on average. There's 310 million Americans, 12,800 McDonald's. The students are directed to make a conjecture and create a mathematical argument. Now, by the way, this problem also is one of our links, so you can get the whole problem in the worksheet for it as part of the link that comes with this webinar. But what's interesting to me about this is notice the directions to the students. The directions were make a conjecture and create a mathematical argument that will validate your conjecture. In other words, do you think that's possible? Yes or no? And what's the mathematics that will make it true or not? Do you think it's not viable? Okay, no. Then what's your argument? And it's an example actually of mathematical modeling also, modeling with mathematics, because the problem is put in a context, McDonald's. You have to take the problem out of context and actually do the mathematics and get comfortable doing the mathematics, and then you have to do what? Put it back into context and say, could it happen or not? So now I'll make my conjecture, and hopefully my mathematical argument is good. Now here's where the teacher team comes in. If you're going to use a task like this, what we want to see is that the collaborative team, like a 4th grade team or a 6th grade team or whatever the team is using a task, that number 1, before they would ever give this task in class, they've done the task together. And notice what the directions say here. In your teacher team, discuss your expectations for student demonstration of quality work in defense of their mathematical argument for the problem. I've done this problem with a lot of math teachers, and there's a wide range of what people think would be high-quality student work for this open-ended problem. So the same is true for you. What exactly would you expect? And the team has that discussion. They do the problem together. They kind of see what the different components and parts of it are, If it's like, if you're going to use it as a surfboard where you're actually going to score it, then how would we score it? Would it be worth 5 points, 10 points? How would we decide what kind of points? Will you get points for doing what kind of work? And then notice the second part of the task. Using tasks like this require really effective management in class with the problem. Because why? Because kids are going to be working together. They're going to have a lot of peer-to-peer discussion. And now what's the teacher supposed to do to ensure that that discussion is effective? So notice part 2 here, what a teacher team decides ahead of time is how would they lesson plan for the problem so that it would promote student communication of their argument with others. So you actually have to have both things going, and we provide some lesson design models for how to do that. But I really like the fact that when people say, well, what should our teacher team be doing? Well, part of my response is, well, one of the things is deciding on these really great high cognitive demand tasks that will promote the practices, but then 2, decide how you're going to manage and use that task and actually do that. So I know that's a big request, and a lot of teams are asking, well, where do we get the time? And I would argue, yes, you probably do need to be meeting at least weekly in order to have enough discussion around these problems. I'm just showing you this. It's just a fun cartoon. One of the practices is called Attend to Precision, and it is about language, and there's also a thing in there about labeling axes with graphs and stuff. So this boy says, I think we should give it another shot, and his girlfriend's, we should break up, and I can prove it. Here's a graph of our relationship. And he says, maybe you're right. I knew data would convince you, she says. No, I just think I can do better than someone who doesn't label her axes. Okay, I can hear the thunderous laughter. Okay, maybe not. But anyway, just thought I'd share that with you. One of the things I've been saying a lot is that this brings us back to this notion of how do any of us as classroom teachers actually check for student understanding so that we can tell, because the Common Core practices, the content itself as well as the practices, demand student demonstration of understanding. So the question becomes, as teachers, how do we then check for understanding, right? And the best way to check for understanding is through a lot of small group collaborative work, peer-to-peer discussions with the teachers. And I've been suggesting that the most significant conversation should be taking place student to student from now on. That the bulk of, yes, there is a role for the teacher, and the teacher does need to have a role in the conversations with students, but from a checking for understanding point of view, the significant conversation should be taking place peer-to-peer. And it's what I'm calling the 65% rule, which basically means that 65% of classroom time dedicated for mathematics should be spent in peer-to-peer communication. Students working on projects and work together, problems together, whether it's with one other person or 2 or 3, 4 people working together, well managed, posed by the teachers, and then that is a primary vehicle for the teacher to check for understanding and also do some differentiation. So we could obviously do a webinar just on instruction, and maybe we will down the road, but that would be an important point. The other is that you think about your lesson planning for the rest of your life from the student's point of view. That's what the Common Core demands. That's what the practices demand, is that it really is when a student walks into your classroom and sits in a desk in your class, from their point of view, what is life like at the beginning of the hour, or the beginning of the math time, if it's elementary school, and when you're doing the third example, when you're doing your summary, what are the students doing? What are the students doing? It's always about what are the students doing, not what's the teacher doing. So to provide and really develop the reasoning and sense-making required of the Common Core, I really feel like lesson planning has to be done from the student's point of view by your teacher team. And I want to encourage you to if there's any simple message here today from an instructional point of view, it would be to think about life from the student's point of view, and are they getting that 65% of the time that from their point of view they're actually in a peer-to-peer communication, not either peer to teacher or peer sitting there waiting silently while the teacher is dealing with other peers. So keep that other students. So keep that in mind. Here's one of the tools we provide. It's actually figure 212 in the leadership book, but again, we provide you with this online resource. It shows up in all the books, but and I'm only showing you the top half of a 2-page tool, but basically it's a tool that identifies the learning target, identifies the practice, identifies the ways in which you're going to check for understanding using formative assessment in class, the step 2 and 3 stuff that's in our cycle, and then also assessing and advancing questions when you do tasks, and you'll go through it. I'll just leave it at that. But it's a way to kind of organize your thoughts as you think about how are we doing at putting together lessons that honor the spirit of the Common Core's mathematical practices. Once you get past that sort of instructional aspect of it, which in steps 2 and 3, it takes us to step 4, which is this moment in which a surfboard is given for an evaluative purpose, a diagnostic purpose, but you choose to use it also for a formative learning opportunity for the child. And so that provides opportunities for the students to actually work together, to say, okay, I took this test, I got 41 out of 60, but I must embrace my errors. And I had 19 points wrong, 19 things scored wrong, 19 points values worth. And what I need to do is find out which learning targets did that come from. And if I could identify those learning targets, then, maybe I didn't do everything wrong, but I have a couple of concepts wrong. I have 2 or 3 learning targets that I need to go relearn. And now I re-engage in that work and then once again reassess so that I can show you what I know. Because no longer would an assessment instrument, a test or quiz of any type, be used primarily for summative purposes, as I mentioned earlier, but rather a student comes to class and takes the test because if there are things that get wrong, they're going to be required to take action on what they got wrong. And if we could get that loop of student, and they see the test as a check-in moment to just find out where they're at, not as a final summative moment. And hopefully they're going to do really well. But if they don't, they're going to be required to do that makeup work. And the reason that's so important in mathematics, for those of you that are online, I know you get this. The reason why it's so important in mathematics, it's because we're vertically connected. We really need you to learn October and November's material to have success in December and January. So if you haven't shown us you've learned it, we're going to keep putting you in a recurring cycle of learning as we continue to move along. So that's part of the idea of step 4. And then in step 5 is where your team would actually come together to take a look at improving your grading accuracy, improving your interventions, working on the kinds of interventions that you need in order to help students in that next cycle of learning based on whichever particular learning targets as a collective team students seem to be weak at, not just an individual student. You make decisions about certain elements of your next unit's design because you know your students are going to need it in general. So that's the nature of a kind of a cohesive way to, on a unit-by-unit basis, year-by-year basis, begin to attack and address the Common Core in a way that gives you that payoff of 0.73 standard deviation above the norm and improvement in student achievement. And one of the things I just want to say as you finish a unit and you actually get to this point where you're looking at a more systemic intervention for some students, other than just the change up of your instruction or the tier 1 stuff, but more tier 2 kinds of support and help, is that it should be required and coherent. So what we don't want to see in any elementary school, middle school, or high school is all the teachers just doing their own form of tier 2 intervention. They'll come see me after school, or I've got this after school program, or you know what, if you come in and do this thing before school, then I'll give you. We want that to be required of all students, and it's got to be coherent from teacher to teacher. So it's not optional. These things are things you have to go through and do, whatever we believe that important support is. And we have lots of suggestions about how to do this really well. It's chapter 5 of all the books in the series. And then finally, another piece that I shared with you as an online resource, and you'll have the link to this tool as well, is a figure that actually presents what we consider to be high leverage actions of mathematics collaborative teams. So if you are if you're working together as a team around mathematics issues and issues of mathematics education for your children, elementary, middle, or high, then these are I've taken you through them rather quickly today, but these are what we believe to be the really high leverage, high payoff actions that from research we know if you did these things really well, then you would be well on your way as a team to performing at a really high level, your students performing at a really high level in mathematics. So I just want to encourage you to know that we've provided that summary for you as well. All right. With that, Jeff, we'll go to questions.
Thanks, Tim. The first question really is one that speaks to the example you had given about the McDonald's consumption in the United States. And the question is, how would you suggest, or what strategies do you know of that would help teachers build connections with high school age students to make real world connections through the Common Core state standards?
Yeah, I think, well, obviously as the content gets more difficult, more rigorous in high school, I think that the opportunity for modeling, of course, is rich. I mean, it is rich in elementary as well, but because of the nature of the problems. And one of the things is I think every unit should probably have at least one task that throughout the whole high school year that provides some kind of mathematical modeling for students as a way to draw them in and draw them interested to the topic. And there are a lot of good resources. Actually, I think in Chapter 2 of our high school book, we actually provide a bunch of online resources you can go to find good modeling tasks, and including we provide some of our own. But I think that has to be a pursuit of the teachers as long as that modeling task is connected to the content that they're teaching in that particular unit. And I would say that without getting too specific because I don't want to be endorsing any particular company's product or whatever, I think that there's a lot of really good, if you see the online resources we provide in our book, that'll be one place. But then I think there's also almost every major publishing company right now is providing a lot of great mathematical tasks, mathematical modeling tasks that you can then use and borrow and be able to get as a resource. So I don't know if that answers the question, because I don't know if it was so much the question was where do we get them, but it's like, should we use them to motivate kids? Was that the nature of the question?
I think you did a nice job of.
Okay. Hi, Jeff, I lost you on sound.
I should be back up now at this point. Can you hear me okay?
All right. Yep,
Perfect.
Go ahead.
The next question talks about the cycle that you described this afternoon from the perspective of an entire math department that's only 4 or 5 teachers large. When you're talking about 4 or 5 teachers across all courses in a small school, when and where you would experience what we would describe as being the singleton. How do you address that from a collaborative standpoint, from the Common Core, in terms of really effectively developing instruction around this cycle that you've described?
Sure. Yeah, that's actually a great question. We see that a lot. I mean, we get asked about that quite a bit. From my perspective, in mathematics, it's even better. It's better that it can be done that way, because when you have a small mathematics department, what you can do is a vertical connecting on a daily basis that we just don't have. So, for example, you can, they might not be able to, on a unit, like, so if I'm teaching algebra, you're teaching geometry, someone else is teaching algebra too, we're like, well, we're all teaching our own course, right, for high school, let's say. But at the same time, we are all teaching the 8 mathematical practices. So we can be meeting to literally provide support for each other on, well, how are you getting mathematical modeling done in the current unit that you're in? How am I doing it in my unit? How are you doing? And we can share that together. We can even do problems together, because I might end up learning something that you're actually going to need me to do, because we have a learning progression in the high school standards. So I think there's a lot of work you can do, but the work changes a little bit because the collaboration is going to be vertical collaboration across the practices and across the learning progression. So, for example, a major topic in high school is the statistics theme that is being woven through all 4 years of high school. So now we can come together and talk about, well, what are the statistics work that we're doing with freshmen versus sophomores versus juniors, and making that domain come alive, or conceptual category in this case for high school, make that come alive. So I think their discussions are just a little bit different and how they address that.
Great, thank you. The next question relates really to embedding this culture of utilizing this cycle. And if you're in the process of establishing your school as a professional learning community, how long would you really estimate the time it takes to make this cycle an embedded part of the culture, especially in schools where you see high levels of turnover within the team, where really there might only be one teacher remaining from year to year?
Yeah. Well, first of all, one of the things I left out of today's presentation from a time point of view is I write in the series, I write in Chapter 1 about the 7 stages of collaborative teams. And I really believe in those 7 stages. And what I think happens is we move through those 7 stages, and without getting into great detail, stages 1, 2, and 3 are sort of minimalist stages. You're not really you're coming together, but you don't really know why you're together. You're coming together and you're maybe working, talking about stuff, but no one's really required to do any of that work together, right? They're not really required to do anything. But once your team gets to begin to do the hard work in stages 4 and 5 of assessment and all those step 1 things that I talked about, that's when you're starting to become a true collaborative team in a professional learning community at work. And then when you get to instruction, that's what I call stages 6 and 7, or actually not myself. I actually kind of adapted it from Bill Faraday's work. And one of the things that I like about that is what I just do with every school is I say, okay, here it is. Here's the descriptors. Now, what stage are you in? And within a school, you'll have teams at varieties of stages. They'll be at stage 2 or stage 4 or stage 6. And my answer is just keep working. The goal is to get yourself to stage 7 and be a highly functioning team. It's why I gave that graphic earlier today. And here's 5 stages of being in that assessment place. Which stage are you in? And it's okay if you're in stage 2. Just keep moving. And so as a leader of that, my goal is to help my teams identify where they're at, and then say, all right, here are the descriptions of what it would look like if we keep moving forward, and then let's do it. So how long? Well, my answer is it could be you can get it done this year. It could be 3 years. I mean, it depends on the dynamics of your culture and really the dynamics of how you put your teams together. What I think's okay, though, is that you have sort of what I would call differentiated expectations for your teams. Just like we want differentiated learning for students, I think you're going to have differentiated expectations for your teams. Some teams might really be ready to push hard into stage 4 or 5, but you've got a few teams that really just need to get to stage 3, and your job is to get them there now and help them get there and understand what that means. So it's not that there's this magic moment where we just all are there. I think the nature of social learning community process is just a forever pursuit. So I guess I would just say we pursue it forever.
Thanks, Tim. Well, unfortunately, this takes us to the end of the session, bringing this afternoon's session to a close. Before we leave, however, if you'd like what you've heard this afternoon, minus the technical difficulties, and you'd like to explore this idea of a professional learning community at work model in greater depth and in greater detail, taking your understanding to the next level, please make it a point to join us at the annual PLC at Work Summit in Phoenix, Arizona from February 20th through the 22nd in 2013. For additional information, as I mentioned before, don't hesitate to contact me directly, or for additional information and support, utilize the resources listed on the screen. Thank you, Dr. Canold, for your time and insight this afternoon, and thanks to all of our participants for joining us on this webinar. Don't forget, we'll be hosting Part 3 of this webinar series on Thursday, December 13th with Kenneth Williams. And as a reminder, you will be emailed the link on this screen to view the webinar recording and handouts within the next 5 business days. And please, if you have any remaining questions, don't hesitate to submit them before we end the session here. Again, thanks for your time, and have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for taking the time to participate with us. We really appreciate it. Bye, Jeff.